Rare earths.
Critical minerals.
The rare earth minerals.
Bit about rare earth minerals.
Rare earths and rare earth magnets underpin all of modern technology.
An obscure bunch of rocks have become the hottest geopolitical bargaining chips of the decade, possibly the century. They don't make for snappy headlines, but with supply chains now in chaos, lots of people are about to find out just how critical these so-called rare earths are and how much we've taken them for granted.
Let's not take it for granted.
Today, we're going to examine these critical minerals, explain why they're so important, and look at the extreme lengths countries are willing to go to access them. Plus, how they're reshaping markets and power relationships around the world. My name is Guy, and you're watching The Coin Bureau. Some know them as critical minerals. President Trump has renamed the whole lot of them raw earth. But whatever you call them, this group of mineral resources is the lifeblood of modern technology. Critical minerals include not only the 17 elements known as rare earths, but also others like cobalt, nickel, graphite, and lithium that are outside this group but similarly important. But what makes a mineral critical and not merely important or vital? Well, the difference is supply chain vulnerability. If a country is reliant on foreign imports for an important mineral for which there is no substitute, then they may deem it critical for policymaking purposes. Different geopolitical, environmental, and economic vulnerabilities affect supply chains from country to country, so critical lists vary. The EU and UK, for example, have identified 34 minerals as critical, whereas the US Geological Survey lists 50. And recently, President Trump ordered another 4 minerals added to this list, plus, quote, any other element, compound, or material determined to be of critical importance by the chair of the recently established National Energy Defense Council. Now, to understand why these minerals are so important, let's take a closer look at what they're needed for. In case it wasn't clear enough, we're not just talking about consumer electronics here. This list includes just about everything that you can switch on and off nowadays. All clean energy technology, for example, from EVs to solar farms and wind turbines, depends on minerals like silica, selenium, tellurium, copper, nickel, lithium, cobalt, iron, boron, and rare earths. More importantly, critical minerals are needed in vast quantities for military applications. An F-35 fighter jet contains more than 400 kilograms of rare earth elements. An Arleigh Burke-class DDG-51 destroyer contains more than 2,300 kilograms, and a Virginia-class submarine contains around 4,200 kilograms. That is a lot of raw earth. Meanwhile, another important use for critical minerals in both civilian and military applications is in magnets. The rare earths neodymium, dysprosium, samarium, and praseodymium are used in various combinations with cobalt, iron, and boron to make permanent magnets that are extremely strong, durable, and resistant to demagnetization. And no, I'd never heard of neodymium or indeed dysprosium, samarium, or praseodymium either before making this video. Now, powerful neodymium iron-boron magnets are essential components of high-torque EV motors and smartphone vibration engines, wind turbines and power tools, hard disk drives, headphones, and speakers. They also steer precision-guided missiles, power UAV motors, and make possible targeting and fire control systems in tanks and aircraft. Highly stable samarium cobalt magnets are needed for precision drives in robotics, medical pumps, aerospace and satellite components, sensors, and data storage. They can endure high temperatures and are corrosion resistant and highly radiation tolerant, making them crucial for missile airframes, jet engines, satellites, and naval mines. Other minerals predominantly used for weapon systems include antimony, which is needed to make armor-piercing ammunition and explosives, tungsten, needed for kinetic energy penetrators and high-temperature applications, and tantalum, needed for missile parts and jet engines. I could keep going, but I think you get the picture. Minerals are to modern technology what fossil fuels were to the Industrial Revolution.
It's the place to be when you're in need of amazing crypto deals and opportunities. It's got savings that you won't believe, like money off those pesky trading fees. It's the Coin Bureau deals page. Sign up bonuses and discounts too. The Coin Bureau deals page. We put these deals together just for you, just for you.
But, as the name suggests, rare earth minerals are very rarely found in concentrations large enough to be economically viable. For viable deposits to form, you need a geological Goldilocks situation with the perfect amount of heat and pressure, just the right magma chemistry and hydrothermal fluid activity to converge over millions of years. These elements require highly specific tectonic environments, such as the slow cooling of alkaline magmas or the interaction of mineral-rich fluids with unique rock formations to concentrate into economically viable deposits. And even then, many deposits are chemically locked within minerals that are difficult and energy-intensive to extract. This combination of geological rarity and technical complexity makes large, accessible rare earth deposits exceptionally scarce, and is why only a handful of regions, like China's Bayan Obo or the Mountain Pass mine in the United States, came to dominate global supply. California's Mountain Pass mine produced the majority of the world's rare earth elements from the 1950s to the 1980s. Production was driven by Cold War demand for nuclear and aerospace technologies, but after it ended, the US left the fate of Mountain Pass up to market forces. China, meanwhile, began developing its rare earth industry in the 1950s. Its answer to Mountain Pass was the Bayan Obo deposit in Inner Mongolia, which is the world's largest known deposit of rare earth elements and home to mineral resources of exceptionally high purity. Beijing was quick to recognize the strategic importance of this sector, and in the 1980s it invested heavily in research and development. It also implemented export rebates to give the sector a boost, and by 1986 China had surpassed the US to become the world's top producer of rare earths. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping made a now famous comment that is often paraphrased as, quote, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." Few people in the English-speaking world thought anything of it because, the world runs on oil, not minerals. It wasn't exactly a zinger for the history books, but in hindsight, it looks pretty darn prescient. In 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement and China's own Made in China 2025 policy prompted Beijing to proactively expand its capabilities in mining, processing, and refining the minerals that would be needed for the transition to clean energy sources and advanced technology manufacturing. By 2024, most of the goals of the Made in China 2025 policy were considered achieved despite US efforts to curb the program. China now controls 58% of global rare earth mining, 89% of separation, and 92% of magnet production. It's almost as if that was the real motivation behind the green agenda all along. Meanwhile, dwindling production in the US led to Mountain Pass closing in 2002. The Pentagon and US policymakers gave little thought to minerals until the 2010s, and China's dominance was seen as a matter of business, not one of national security. Over the last decade, the US did not make comparable investments in rare earth extraction. The war on terror also ran out of steam, leading the US defense establishment to transition to a new great power competition with China, setting the stage for the situation we see today. Notably, it began with Obama's military pivot to Asia policy and has continued as the Trump-Biden-Trump trade war, which has crescendoed to the point where China has now banned exports of many critical minerals to the US. China is expected to start issuing export licenses on a case-by-case basis, and preventing the US military from accessing Chinese mineral exports will be top priority. With US defense stockpiles now running out, a supply shock appears to be imminent. What resources make it to the US will inevitably be rationed to the military first, making it increasingly likely that the consumer will have to digest higher prices for just about everything containing critical minerals, which, as we've learned, is a lot of stuff. So, it's a good thing that the US has been trying to reshore mineral production then. In 2017, it revived Mountain Pass under the ownership of a company called MP Materials, which resumed production. However, Underfunding in R&D means that the US lacks the technical expertise to process the mine's mineral output, which has to be sent to China for processing instead. This obviously isn't ideal, and MP Materials has since been the focal point of American efforts to rebuild a complete domestic supply chain for rare earths. To this end, the Department of Defense announced a remarkably ambitious 2027 mine-to-magnet goal. Since 2020, it has handed out $439 million to make this happen, but progress has been slow. This is because mineral production is one of the most difficult industries to reshore, and that's because of the rarity of economically viable deposits and the decades of infrastructure investment and research needed to develop mining, separation, refining, and processing facilities, and the technical expertise needed to run them. There are other barriers too, though. Take gallium, for example, which sits at the top of America's list of critical minerals. Gallium is an essential ingredient for making semiconductors, solar farms, satellites, laser systems, night vision and thermal imaging, advanced radar and communications, thermometers, and nuclear weapons. The US is entirely dependent on imports to meet domestic gallium demand, but after it hit China with semiconductor export restrictions last December, Beijing banned exports of gallium, germanium, and other key materials with military applications to the US. Some 90% of gallium is produced as a byproduct of aluminium production, which consumes vast amounts of electricity. China devotes about 6% of its total energy output to aluminium production. But the US power grid can't currently support new aluminium production due to its lack of capacity. Even after a tree falling over in Ohio caused a blackout for 55 million people in the northeastern US and parts of Canada back in 2003, the grid wasn't updated. The US now produces half as much energy as China and is struggling to power ChatGPT as it is. Meeting domestic gallium demand with domestic energy supply is not going to happen anytime soon. Unless the US can delete its northern border, that is. Canada happens to be the world's fourth largest producer of aluminium, thanks to its abundant hydroelectric power resources. This and other mineral resources are widely believed to be President Trump's motive for his policy of wanting to annex Canada. And the fact that this looks like a better option speaks volumes about the difficulty of establishing new domestic production. Recognizing the challenges and time horizons involved, the Biden administration advanced Friendshoring as an alternative. Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen popularized this term in April 2022 when she encouraged the sourcing of critical resources from a large number of geopolitical allies rather than relying on an exclusive bloc, i.e. China. Friendshoring as foreign policy gave us multilateral initiatives like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or PGII, and the Minerals Security Partnership, both established in 2022. The PGII was billed as America's answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative, designed to organize US investment and rally allied support behind new ex-China supply chains. The Minerals Security Partnership, meanwhile, brought together US allied mining countries to set standards for producing, processing, and recycling of transition materials. But actually replacing existing supply chains will not be easy. A 2023 study by researchers at Johns Hopkins University concluded that to meaningfully friendshore supply chains would require an unprecedented and, quote, highly coordinated international joint industrial strategy that aligns and focuses global investment. Meanwhile, President Trump has given new meaning to the term friendshoring with his proposal to colonize longtime friends of the US. But at the same time, recent developments in US trade policy have thrown the future of friendshoring as it was originally conceived into doubt. Multilateral initiatives like the PGII and Minerals Security Partnership were designed to rally international support for a collective decoupling from China, but all the countries who agreed to sign up have since been subject to punitive US tariffs, and they are not happy about it. Take Canada, for example. After China, the United States' main source of germanium is a Canadian company called Teck Resources. They recover germanium from zinc mining in Alaska, then refine it in Canada and export it back to the US. However, after Trump introduced 25% tariffs on goods from China, the CEO of Teck publicly announced that he was no longer interested in selling to the US market and will redirect Teck's zinc and germanium to markets in Asia. Funny how that works. The EU, meanwhile, is another key party to the Mineral Security Partnership that's now taking a fresh look at China following the collapse of its relationship with the US. China would very much like this, with President Xi and Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently urging EU and UK leaders to join forces with China in safeguarding multilateral trading systems. Something to this end may be in the pipeline soon, as European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and other EU leaders are planning a trip to Beijing this July for a summit with Xi Jinping. This suggests a serious effort to re-engage and a potential pivot from decoupling from China to de-risking from the United States. It wouldn't be the first move in that direction either. Brussels and Beijing have quietly established several economic working groups following a visit by EU Trade Chief Maros Sefcovic in late March. The two sides are now negotiating EV supply chain investment, agri-food market access, and a removal of the European tariffs on Chinese EVs introduced last October. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping recently visited Vietnam and Malaysia on a tour of Southeast Asia that was widely seen as an effort to cast China as a more reliable trading partner than the US. After China, Vietnam and Malaysia are two of the world's biggest producers of critical minerals. Malaysia has the world's largest and one of the only critical mineral separation plants that exist outside of China. In Vietnam, meanwhile, President Luong Quang greeted Xi at the airport and later gave him a 21-gun salute at Hanoi's presidential palace. This made for a sharp contrast with the increasingly fraught relations between the US and Vietnam, on whom President Trump recently introduced and then paused a 46% tariff, to the ire of Vietnamese businesses. According to Chinese news media, Xi urged Vietnam to resist, quote, unilateral bullying, and stated that, quote, China's mega market is always open to Vietnam. President Trump told reporters at the White House, quote, that's a lovely meeting like trying to figure out how do we screw the United States of America. Vietnamese and Chinese media disclosed that the two sides signed some 45 agreements during Xi's visit without providing any details. So then, at the moment, it looks like China has taken over friendshoring duties, while President Trump pivots to a mineral reshoring agenda. Late last month, Trump signed an executive order titled Immediate Measures to Increase American Mineral Production that directs federal agencies to expedite permitting and remove regulatory barriers to mining on federal land. It also invokes war powers under the Defense Production Act that authorized the Secretary of Defense and the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation to finance mineral production projects that directly support domestic capacity. Interestingly, Canada, Australia, and the UK are treated as domestic sources under the Defence Production Act. However, the emergency funding powers aren't unlimited, as projects requiring over $50 million are subject to congressional notification. It's too early to assess what effect this executive order will have, but 2025 should nonetheless be a big year for US critical mineral supply chains. That's because projects under the mine-to-magnet goal are beginning to come to fruition. MP Materials received a little under $100 million in subsidies and tax credits to build a new metallization and magnet production facility called Independence in Fort Worth, Texas. MP is now sending rare earths extracted from Mountain Pass to be refined, metallized, and turned into magnets in Fort Worth. The new facility began commercial production of magnetic metals earlier this year and is expected to slowly scale up magnet production starting in late 2025. The goal is to produce 1,000 tons of finished magnets per year, which it will supply to General Motors and other manufacturers. So it looks like the mine-to-magnet box will be ticked in the US by 2027. Then again, it looks a little cute when compared to the 300,000 tons of these magnets that China produces annually. But the US is no longer 100% dependent on China for magnet metals, and this month it finally stopped sending US rare earths to China for processing. But if it wants domestic production to meet domestic demand, it will need to scale up big time. MP Materials has been trying, having produced a record 1,300 tons of magnetic metals last year. But despite being heavily subsidized by the Pentagon, the company is leaking money like a sieve, losing $28 million in a single quarter last year. Now, part of this is because of China's decades-long head start in this industry. Economies of scale mean that China is able to produce rare earth elements at much lower cost than anyone else, and this drives down prices globally, threatening the economic viability of US projects. And this trend is likely to continue in the coming years because China is already exploring the mineral-rich depths of the Pacific Ocean in a new frontier that the US has already ceded for ideological reasons. Sitting on the sea floor somewhere between Hawaii and Mexico are an estimated 21 billion tons of extremely high ore-grade cobalt, nickel, copper and manganese just waiting to be collected in convenient polymetallic balls. This is the Clarion Clipperton Zone, or CCZ, home to far more critical minerals than all known terrestrial reserves combined. The CCZ is regulated by the International Seabed Authority, or ISA, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The ISA has issued CCZ exploration licenses for deep-sea mining to 21 countries and various private companies, effectively dividing the seabed up between them. China and Russia dominate with a combined 9 permits. Lockheed Martin also held permits but was forced to sell them because the US does not recognize the International Seabed Authority. Despite playing a key role in negotiating the Law of the Sea in 1982, the US has never ratified it because it keeps getting blocked by the Senate. Republican and Democrat presidents have been trying ever since, but have so far been thwarted at every turn by the persistent lobbying of the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation has persuaded generations of senators to resist ratifying the Law of the Sea at all costs, on the grounds that the US doesn't need anyone's permission to mine the seabed. As a result, the US has no exploration licenses and no voting rights over the rules for commercial mining, which are still under development at the ISA. So, it looks like America is leaving the CCZ up to the CCP for now. But when US defense stockpiles of critical minerals start running out in a month or two, just don't be surprised if politicians and lobbyists start humming Under the Sea in the corridors of the US Capitol. We'll have to wait and see how this mineral struggle shakes out, but at the moment, it looks like Trump has blinked first in his own trade war. Will this lead to export controls being relaxed? Well, it's hard to see that happening because this would mean China providing the US with materials for its military once again. That said, stranger things have happened though, like, for instance, Fartcoin rising from the dead to break the $1 billion market cap once again. Wait, are you telling me you haven't been paying attention to crypto lately? Well, before you FOMO back in, you should check out this video for all the upcoming macro and crypto catalysts that could affect prices. Okay, that's all from me for now though. As always, thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. This is Guy, over and out.